April 9th, 1892, dawn. Freezing cold. Nate Champion stands in the doorway of a cabin in northern Wyoming. He's holding a Winchester rifle. Outside, 50 armed men surround the cabin. They've been shooting at him for 6 hours. Nate is 27 years old, a cowboy, a small rancher, and he's about to become the most famous murder victim in Wyoming history. The 50 men outside aren't outlaws. They're an army, hired by the richest cattle barons in Wyoming. Their mission? Kill Nate Champion and anyone like him. Small ranchers, homesteaders, people who dared to challenge the cattle barons' control of Wyoming. This is the Johnson County War, the biggest range war in American history. 50 hired killers invaded an entire county. They had a death list, over 70 names, men they planned to murder. But here's what they didn't expect. The people of Johnson County fought back. 200 armed cowboys and ranchers surrounded the invaders, trapped them, nearly killed all 50 of them. This wasn't a fair fight between good and evil. This was class warfare. Rich versus poor, power versus desperation. And when it was over, nobody won. The cattle barons went free. The small ranchers stayed poor. And Nate Champion, he died alone in a burning cabin. You're listening to Legends of the Frontier. I'm your host. Today we're telling you the true story of the Johnson County War. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We tell the stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about the Old West. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why 50 men invaded Johnson County to commit mass murder, you need to understand Wyoming in the 1880s and 1890s. You need to understand the cattle boom, and you need to understand what happens when a handful of rich men control an entire state. Wyoming territory in the 1880s, wide open range, millions of acres of grassland, perfect for cattle, and the cattle barons knew it. After the Civil War, Texas cattlemen drove massive herds north to Wyoming. The grass was better, the climate was better, and most importantly, the land was free, public domain, open range. By 1885, Wyoming had over 1.5 million cattle. The cattle barons formed the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. This wasn't just a business group, it was a political machine. The WSGA controlled Wyoming. Who were these cattle barons? Men like John Clay, Scottish immigrant, owned hundreds of thousands of acres, controlled multiple ranches. Frank Wolcott, Yale-educated, rich family, owned the VR Ranch. Fred Hesse, German immigrant, wealthy investor. Major Wolcott, another rich rancher with political connections. These men had millions of dollars invested in cattle. They lived in Cheyenne, the territorial capital. They belonged to the Cheyenne Club, one of the most exclusive gentlemen's clubs in America. Imported wines, French chefs, luxury beyond imagination. But here's the thing. They didn't actually work on the ranches. They hired managers. They hired cowboys. They stayed in Cheyenne, making deals and influencing politics. And they controlled everything. The territorial governor, appointed by the president, but the cattle barons influenced who got appointed. The legislature, dominated by cattle baron interests. The courts, the same. Law enforcement, often hired by the cattle barons. If you were a cattle baron in Wyoming in the 1880s, you were untouchable. You made the rules. You enforced the rules. And if anyone challenged you, you destroyed them. But not everyone in Wyoming was a cattle baron. There were also small ranchers, homesteaders, cowboys who wanted to start their own operations. Under the Homestead Act, any American citizen could claim 160 acres of public land, build a cabin, farm it. After 5 years, it was yours. Thousands of people came to Wyoming to homestead. They built small ranches. They raised their own cattle. They tried to make a living. The cattle barons hated them. Why? Because the small ranchers threatened the open range system. The cattle barons didn't own most of the land their cattle grazed on. It was public land. Their business model depended on having unrestricted access to millions of acres of free grassland. When homesteaders claimed land, they fenced it. They controlled water sources. They interrupted the open range. The cattle barons saw this as theft. They called the homesteaders squatters, even though homesteading was completely legal. And then there was the rustling problem. Or was there? The cattle barons claimed that small ranchers were stealing their cattle, changing brands, building herds with stolen stock. Was it true? Sometimes, absolutely. Some small ranchers did rustle cattle. In a territory where cattle roamed free over millions of acres, it was easy to grab a few unbranded calves and claim them as your own. But here's the problem. The cattle barons accused everyone of rustling. If you were a small rancher with a growing herd, you were a rustler. If you were a cowboy who started your own ranch, you were a rustler. If you challenged the cattle barons in any way, you were a rustler. The WSGA pushed through laws that made it almost impossible for small ranchers to operate legally. They made it illegal to brand mavericks, unbranded cattle, outside of the official roundup season. They controlled the roundups. They decided who could participate. If you were a small rancher, you couldn't legally build your herd. You were frozen out. Your only options were to leave, work for the cattle barons, or break their rules. Many chose to break the rules, and the cattle barons used that as justification for what came next. 1889, Ella Watson and Jim Averill, small ranchers near the Sweetwater River in Carbon County, Wyoming. Ella owned a small ranch. Jim ran a store and a small cattle operation. They were homesteaders, legal settlers, but they were in the way. Cattle barons wanted their land. They wanted access to the Sweetwater River, so they accused Ella and Jim of rustling. No trial, no evidence presented in court. On July 20th, 1889, 6 cattlemen rode to Ella and Jim's property. They dragged them from their homes. They hanged them both from a tree. Ella Watson became known in newspaper accounts as Cattle Kate, falsely portrayed as a prostitute who accepted stolen cattle as payment. Pure propaganda. She was a homesteader, a legitimate rancher, and she was murdered. The 6 cattlemen who killed her? They were arrested, but they never went to trial. Witnesses disappeared. Some were killed, others fled Wyoming. The case was dropped. This sent a message to every small rancher in Wyoming. Challenge the cattle barons and you'll die. The law won't protect you. The courts won't help you. You're on your own. More lynchings followed. Tom Wagoner, hanged in 1891. No trial. Accused of rustling. Killed by unknown men who were never arrested. Ringer Jones and John Tisdale, both small ranchers in Johnson County, both murdered in late 1891, shot from ambush. Everyone knew who ordered the killings. Nobody was ever charged. The cattle barons were cleaning house. They were eliminating anyone who threatened their power, and they were getting away with it. Johnson County, Wyoming, northern part of the territory. County seat, Buffalo. By 1891, Johnson County had become the center of resistance to the cattle barons. Why? Because Johnson County had small ranchers who refused to be intimidated. The population of Buffalo was about 500 people. Surrounding ranches and homesteads added maybe 2,000 more. It was a small community. Everyone knew everyone, and they were united. They elected their own sheriff, Red Angus, a former cowboy. He refused to arrest small ranchers on bogus rustling charges. He stood up to the cattle barons. They had their own newspaper, the Buffalo Bulletin. It published articles critical of the WSGA. It defended small ranchers. It exposed cattle baron corruption. They formed their own cattlemen's association, the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association, a direct challenge to the WSGA's monopoly. The cattle barons saw Johnson County as enemy territory. They called it a haven for rustlers. They claimed the entire county was infected with lawlessness. In reality, Johnson County was just trying to govern itself without being controlled by Cheyenne elites. 2 men stood out as leaders of the Johnson County resistance: Nate Champion, 27 years old, a top cowboy, worked on various ranches, started his own small operation, charismatic, brave, respected, and Red Angus the sheriff. He wasn't going to let the cattle barons dictate the law in his county. The cattle barons hated both men. They decided both men had to die. By early 1892, the cattle barons were planning something big, not just another lynching, not just another ambush murder. They were planning an invasion, a military operation. They were going to invade Johnson County and kill everyone on their list. Winter 1892, the cattle barons met in Cheyenne, the Cheyenne Club, expensive cigars, fine whiskey, and a murder plot. They created a death list, 70 names, small ranchers, cowboys, homesteaders, Sheriff Red Angus. Nate Champion at the top, but they couldn't just send a few hired guns. They needed an army, so they hired one, Frank Canton, former Johnson County Sheriff, now working for the cattle barons. He was sent to Texas to recruit gunmen. Canton went to Paris, Texas. He recruited from the toughest men he could find, professional killers, men who would do anything for money. He promised them $5 a day, good money in 1892, plus a $50 bonus for every man they killed. He recruited about 25 Texans, hardened gunmen. They were told they were going to Wyoming to help with a rustling problem. They weren't told they were being hired to commit mass murder. In Wyoming, the cattle barons recruited more men, local ranch managers, cowboys loyal to the big ranches. By April 1892, they had assembled a force of about 50 men. They called themselves the Regulators, like vigilantes, like they were restoring order. In reality, they were an assassination squad. They had the death list, they had the weapons, Springfield rifles, Winchester repeaters, revolvers, ammunition, and they had something else, political protection. The territorial governor knew about the invasion. U.S. senators knew. Nobody stopped them. In fact, the governor promised them that if things went wrong, he'd call in federal troops to rescue them. Think about that. The governor of Wyoming was complicit in a plan to invade a county and murder 70 American citizens. That's not law enforcement. That's state-sponsored terrorism. On April 5, 1892, the Regulators boarded a special train in Cheyenne. The train was chartered by the cattle barons. It carried 50 armed men north toward Johnson County. They also brought 3 wagons full of supplies, tents, food, extra ammunition. They were prepared for a campaign. 2 newspaper reporters went with them to document the glorious restoration of order, to write heroic accounts of the cattle barons' victory. They brought a photographer. They wanted to capture images of the dead rustlers. The train took them to Casper, Wyoming. From there, they rode north on horseback, 50 armed men heading toward Johnson County, ready to kill. April 9th, 1892, early morning, the KC Ranch, a small cabin on the Middle Fork of the Powder River. Nate Champion was staying there with Nick Ray, another cowboy. 2 trappers, Bill Jones and Ben Morrison, were also in the cabin. Around dawn, Jones and Morrison stepped outside. Immediately, gunfire. The Regulators had surrounded the cabin during the night. They captured Jones and Morrison, held them prisoner. Nick Ray tried to get water from the creek. The Regulators shot him. He crawled back into the cabin, badly wounded. Nate Champion dragged him inside, but Nick was dying. He died a few hours later. Now Nate was alone. 50 men outside, 1 man inside. The siege began. The Regulators fired hundreds of rounds at the cabin. Nate fired back. He was a crack shot. He kept them at bay. They couldn't get close. Every time someone tried to approach, Nate drove them back. This wasn't supposed to happen. The plan was to ambush Nate, kill him quickly, and move on to Buffalo. But Nate was fighting back, and he was winning. Hours passed. The Regulators grew frustrated. They couldn't risk a direct assault. Nate would kill several of them. So they waited. They kept shooting. But Nate stayed inside, alive, defiant. Here's something incredible. During the siege, Nate Champion wrote in his diary. He documented everything. He knew he was going to die, but he wanted the world to know what happened. His entries: "Me and Nick was getting breakfast when the attack took place. 2 men here with us, Bill Jones and Ben Morrison. The old man went out, they followed him and shot him. Boys, there is bullets coming like hail. They are shooting from the stable and river and back of the house. Nick is shot but not dead yet. He is awful sick. I must go and wait on him. It is now about 2 hours since the first shot. Nick is still alive. They are still shooting and are all around the house. Nate Champion was trapped, knowing he would die, and he spent his final hours writing, documenting the crime being committed against him, making sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. By afternoon, the regulators were desperate. They loaded a wagon with hay and pine branches. They soaked it with kerosene. Then they pushed it toward the cabin and set it on fire. The cabin caught fire. Nate couldn't stay inside. The smoke was choking him. The flames were spreading. He had 2 choices: burn alive or make a run for it. He chose to run. He kicked open the door. He had his rifle and his revolver. He ran toward the creek, firing as he ran. The regulators opened fire. 28 bullets hit Nate Champion. He died instantly. One of the regulators walked up to Nate's body and pinned a note to his chest. "Cattle thieves, beware." Nate Champion was not a cattle thief. He was a small rancher, a cowboy, a man who refused to submit to the cattle baron's tyranny, and they murdered him for it. The regulators found Nate's diary in the burning cabin. They should have destroyed it. Instead, one of them kept it. Later, it was published in newspapers. Nate's words survived. The truth survived. While the regulators were besieging Nate Champion, a man named Jack Flagg was riding toward Buffalo. He saw the siege from a distance. He realized what was happening. Flagg galloped to Buffalo. He burst into town shouting that an army of hired killers was invading the county, that Nate Champion was under siege, that the regulators were coming for everyone on their death list. Buffalo exploded. Fury, terror. The people of Johnson County realized they were under attack. Sheriff Red Angus immediately organized a defense. He sent riders to every ranch and homestead. He called for every man who could shoot to come to Buffalo. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, over 200 men arrived. Cowboys, ranchers, homesteaders, miners, store owners. They grabbed their rifles and rode out. They weren't going to let the cattle barons murder their neighbors. This was not what the regulators expected. The plan was to ride into Buffalo, execute the men on the death list, and ride out. They thought the people would be too scared to fight back. They were wrong. The people of Johnson County were done being intimidated. They were done watching their friends get lynched. They were done living in fear. If the cattle barons wanted a war, they'd get one. Sheriff Angus led the group, over 200 armed men. They rode south toward the KC Ranch. They weren't going to rescue Nate Champion. It was too late for that. But they were going to trap the regulators. They were going to make them pay. The regulators knew they were in trouble. Jack Flagg had seen them. Buffalo knew they were coming. The element of surprise was gone. They needed to retreat. They rode to the TA Ranch about 14 miles south of Buffalo. The TA Ranch was owned by a cattle baron. They thought they'd be safe there. They fortified the position. The ranch house was sturdy. They had supplies. They built barricades using logs and hay bales. They prepared for a siege. 50 men, well armed. They thought they could hold out until help arrived. On April 10th, the Johnson County forces arrived. Over 200 men. They surrounded the TA Ranch. The siege began. For 3 days, the 2 sides exchanged gunfire. The Johnson County men had the numbers. The regulators had better positions. Nobody could advance without taking casualties. It was a stalemate. But the Johnson County forces weren't in a hurry. They had time, they had numbers, and they were angry. They wanted revenge for Nate Champion, for all the murders, for all the lynchings. They wanted to wipe out the regulators. The regulators knew they were trapped. They sent a courier to Cheyenne, a desperate message to the governor. They needed help. They needed rescue. Without it, they would all die. The Johnson County men built a mobile fort. They called it the Ark of Safety, somewhat ironically. It was a massive log structure on wheels, bulletproof. The plan was to push it close to the ranch house, then storm the building. The regulators would have no chance. By April 13th, the Ark was almost ready. The regulators were running out of time. They barricaded themselves in the ranch house. They wrote their wills. They prepared to die. And then salvation arrived. Not from Wyoming authorities, from Washington, D.C. The governor had called in federal troops. On April 13th, 3 companies of the 6th U.S. Cavalry arrived at the TA Ranch. Over 100 federal soldiers, led by Colonel J.J. Van Horn. They had been ordered by the President of the United States to intervene. Here's how it happened. The Wyoming governor, Amos Barber, sent a telegram to President Benjamin Harrison. He claimed there was an insurrection in Johnson County. He claimed armed mobs were threatening law-abiding citizens. He asked for federal troops. None of this was true. The regulators were the invaders. They had murdered Nate Champion. They had a death list with 70 names. They were the criminals. But the governor lied, and the president believed him. The federal troops surrounded the TA Ranch. They ordered both sides to stand down. The Johnson County forces were furious. They had the regulators trapped. They were about to finish this. And now the federal government was protecting the murderers. But what could they do? You can't fight the U.S. Army. Sheriff Angus ordered his men to withdraw. They left, angry, betrayed, cheated out of justice. The federal troops arrested the regulators, all 50 of them. They were marched to Fort McKinney, a military post near Buffalo. They were held as prisoners. Technically, they were under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and insurrection. In reality, they were being protected. The regulators should have been tried in Johnson County, but the cattle barons pulled strings. The venue was changed to Cheyenne, where the cattle barons controlled everything, where they'd never be convicted. The Johnson County forces realized they'd been played. The government wasn't there to deliver justice. The government was there to save the cattle barons. The system was rigged. The rich would never face consequences. The regulators were held at Fort McKinney for a few months. Then they were transferred to Cheyenne for trial. They were charged with murder, specifically the murder of Nate Champion and Nick Ray. But the trial never happened. Why? The cattle barons used every legal trick available. They filed motions. They demanded changes of venue. They delayed. And most importantly, they made sure the key witnesses couldn't testify. The 2 trappers, Bill Jones and Ben Morrison, who had been captured at the KC Ranch, disappeared. They were paid off by the cattle barons. They left Wyoming. They never testified. Other witnesses were intimidated. Some fled the state. Some changed their stories. The prosecution's case fell apart. In January 1893, 9 months after the invasion, the charges were dropped. All 50 regulators walked free. Not one of them spent a day in prison. Not one of them was convicted of any crime. They murdered Nate Champion in front of witnesses, and they got away with it. Why? Because they had money. They had political connections. They had the governor protecting them. They had the federal government protecting them. The system was designed to protect the rich and powerful, and it worked perfectly. The people of Johnson County were devastated. They'd fought back. They'd trapped the invaders. They'd been ready to deliver justice. And the government had stopped them. Then the courts had freed the murderers. What was the point of law if it only protected the rich? Some of the regulators left Wyoming. The Texas gunmen went back to Texas. They'd been promised bonuses for every man they killed. They killed Nate Champion and Nick Ray. They got their money, then they left. Just hired killers. No different than any other job. The cattle barons went back to Cheyenne, back to the Cheyenne Club, back to their luxury. They'd tried to invade and conquer Johnson County. They'd failed, but they'd paid no price for trying. So what happened after the Johnson County War? Did anything change? In some ways, yes. In most ways, no. The cattle barons' power began to decline, not because of justice, not because they were punished, but because the economics of cattle ranching changed. The open range era was ending. Homesteaders kept coming, fences went up. The massive cattle operations became less profitable. Many cattle barons sold out or went bankrupt. By 1900, the Wyoming cattle kingdom was over. Small ranchers survived. They stayed in Johnson County. They built their ranches. They raised families. They never got justice for what happened, but they didn't leave. They didn't give up. That's its own kind of victory. Buffalo grew. It became a prosperous town. Today, it's a quiet, peaceful place. You'd never know it was once the center of a range war. The Johnson County War is history, but it's not forgotten. Nate Champion became a folk hero, not in his own time. In his own time, the cattle barons' newspapers called him a rustler. They justified his murder. But later generations saw the truth. Nate Champion was a brave man who stood up to tyranny. He died fighting. His diary preserved the truth. Today, he's remembered as a hero. The federal government's role in the Johnson County War is a dark chapter in American history. Federal troops were used to protect a gang of murderers. The President of the United States was lied to by the Wyoming governor, and federal power was used to prevent justice. It's a reminder that the government doesn't always serve the people. Sometimes it serves the rich and powerful. The Johnson County War didn't end cattle baron violence in Wyoming. More murders happened, more lynchings, more intimidation. But the cattle barons never again tried a mass invasion. They'd learned that ordinary people would fight back. Let's talk about some of the specific men who organized the invasion. Because these weren't anonymous villains. These were real people with names, faces, and reputations. And they all walked away unpunished. Frank Wolcott, leader of the Regulators, Yale graduate, wealthy rancher. He planned the invasion. He led the men. He gave the order to burn Nate Champion alive. After the trial collapsed, he went back to his ranch. He lived comfortably. He died of natural causes years later, never punished. Frank Canton, former sheriff turned hired gun. He recruited the Texas Killers. He participated in the siege of Nate Champion. After the invasion, he left Wyoming. He moved to Oklahoma. Later, he became a lawman again in Alaska. He wrote a memoir portraying himself as a hero fighting rustlers. He died in 1927, never punished. Major Wolcott, another leader of the Regulators, rich rancher, political connections. He helped plan the invasion. He was present at the TA Ranch siege. After the charges were dropped, he returned to his ranch. He continued to be a prominent citizen, died of natural causes, never punished. The cattle barons who financed the invasion, John Clay, Fred Hesse, and others, they stayed in Cheyenne. They continued to run their businesses. They were never charged with any crime. Their names weren't even on the indictments. They paid for an invasion, and they faced no consequences. This is the reality of the Johnson County War. The men who ordered the murders, financed the invasion, and killed innocent people all walked away free. Because they were rich, because they had political power, because the system protected them. The Johnson County War has been mythologized in various ways over the years. Books, movies, TV shows, and like most Old West stories, the myth doesn't match the reality. The myth says it was a war between lawmen and rustlers, good guys versus bad guys, order versus chaos. That's not true. It was a class war. Rich versus poor, powerful versus powerless. The myth says the small ranchers were all rustlers, that they deserved what they got. That's cattle baron propaganda. Some small ranchers did rustle cattle, but most were legitimate homesteaders. And even if they were rustlers, they deserved trials, not execution squads. The myth says the Regulators were trying to restore law and order. That's a lie. The Regulators were assassins. They had a death list. They planned to murder 70 men without trials. That's not law enforcement. That's terrorism. The myth says the federal government was neutral, that federal troops just separated two warring factions. That's false. The federal government protected the murderers. The governor lied to the president. Federal troops prevented justice. The government took sides, and they sided with the rich. Here's the reality. The Johnson County War was an attempted genocide. The cattle barons tried to eliminate an entire class of people, small ranchers and homesteaders, who threatened their economic control. They hired an army, they invaded a county, they murdered innocent people, and they almost got away with it. They didn't get away with it because the people of Johnson County fought back. 200 ordinary citizens grabbed their guns and said, "No, not here, not to us." That's the real story. That's the story that matters. The Johnson County War is a story about power, about who has it and who doesn't, about what happens when the rich control the government, about what happens when the legal system serves the wealthy instead of the people, and most importantly, it's a story about resistance, about ordinary people refusing to be victims, about standing up to tyranny even when the odds are impossible. The people of Johnson County didn't win in the end. The cattle barons went free, but the people survived. They stayed. They built lives. That's its own kind of victory. Let's talk about Nate Champion's diary one more time, because it's one of the most remarkable historical documents from the Old West. Nate knew he was going to die. He was trapped in a cabin, surrounded by 50 armed men. He'd been under siege for hours. His friend Nick Ray was dying beside him, and Nate spent those hours writing, not just writing, documenting, recording facts, making sure the truth would survive. Here are some of his final entries. It is now about noon. They are shooting at the house. Nick is dead. He died about 9 o'clock. I see a smoke down at the stable. I think they have fired it. I don't think they intend to let me get away this time. Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. And then he made his run for it. And he died, but his diary survived. One of the regulators kept it. Later, it was published in newspapers across the country. People read Nate Champion's words. They understood what really happened. The cattle barons couldn't control that narrative. They tried. They published articles calling Nate a rustler. They tried to justify his murder, but Nate's own words told the truth. And the truth was more powerful than their propaganda. Nate Champion's diary is now preserved in the Wyoming State Archives. You can read it today. His handwriting, his words, written in the final hours of his life. It's a powerful reminder that truth can survive even when justice fails. The Johnson County War has been adapted into various films and books. The most famous is the 1980 movie Heaven's Gate, directed by Michael Cimino. It was a massive box office failure. The budget was enormous. The production was troubled. The movie bombed. But it told the story of the Johnson County War fairly accurately. It portrayed the cattle barons as villains and the small ranchers as victims. It showed the class warfare. It showed the government's betrayal. The movie's failure wasn't because of historical inaccuracy. It was because it was slow, meandering, and over 3 hours long. But if you can sit through it, it's a powerful film. It captures the tragedy of the Johnson County War better than any other adaptation. There have been books too. The War on Powder River by Helena Huntington Smith is one of the best histories of the conflict. It was written in 1966. Smith interviewed descendants of the participants. She examined original documents. She told the story from the perspective of the small ranchers. It's a detailed, well-researched account. Why has the Johnson County War been less famous than other Old West events like the OK Corral or the Battle of Little Bighorn? Probably because it doesn't fit the heroic narrative. There are no clear heroes. The good guys didn't win. The bad guys got away with murder. It's too complicated, too morally ambiguous. too close to the truth about how power really works. But that's exactly why the Johnson County War matters. It's not a sanitized myth. It's not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a real story about real people, about power and injustice, about ordinary people fighting back against impossible odds, about how the system protects the rich and punishes the poor. That's history worth remembering. So what do we learn from the Johnson County War? Here are the real lessons, not the sanitized Hollywood version. The truth. Lesson 1. The law doesn't always protect the innocent. The regulators murdered Nate Champion. Everyone knew it. There were witnesses, there was evidence, and they all walked free because the legal system protected them, because they were rich, because they had political power. Justice isn't blind. Justice serves whoever can afford it. Lesson 2. Ordinary people can fight back. The Johnson County forces outnumbered the regulators 4-1. They surrounded them. They nearly killed them all. If the federal government hadn't intervened, the people would have won. That's significant. The cattle barons thought the people were sheep. They were wrong. When pushed far enough, ordinary people will fight. Lesson 3. The government doesn't always serve the people. Federal troops were sent to Wyoming to protect murderers. The governor lied to the president. The U.S. Army prevented justice. The government sided with the rich and powerful. Not because they cared about law and order, because the cattle barons had connections, because they had influence. Power protects power. Lesson 4. Violence begets violence. The cattle barons started this. They lynched Ella Watson and Jim Averill. They murdered Tom Wagoner. They killed John Tisdale. They created the conditions for war. And then they were shocked when people fought back. If you rule by violence, don't be surprised when violence comes for you. Lesson 5. History is written by whoever survives. The cattle barons tried to control the narrative. They called the small ranchers rustlers. They portrayed themselves as heroes. But Nate Champion's diary survived. The truth survived. History remembered what really happened, not the version the cattle barons wanted. The truth. The Johnson County War is a microcosm of American history. It's about who has power and who doesn't. It's about the struggle between the rich and everyone else. It's about the gap between the promise of justice and the reality of how the system works. And it's a reminder that ordinary people have always had to fight for their rights. Nobody just hands you justice. You have to take it. On April 9th, 1892, 50 hired killers invaded Johnson County, Wyoming. They had a death list. 70 names. Men they planned to murder. They killed Nate Champion. They killed Nick Ray. They tried to kill many more, but the people of Johnson County fought back. 200 armed citizens surrounded the invaders, trapped them, nearly wiped them out. If the federal government hadn't intervened, they would have. That's not the story the cattle barons wanted told, but it's the truth. The regulators walked free. Not one of them was punished, because they were rich, because they had political power, because the system protected them. Nate Champion died in a burning cabin. No justice, no accountability, just murder with impunity. 132 years later, we're still arguing about the same issues. Who has power? Who deserves justice? Does the legal system serve everyone or just the rich? The Johnson County War doesn't answer those questions, but it forces us to ask them. If you made it this far, thank you. These are the stories that need to be told, the complicated ones, the uncomfortable ones. Do me a favor, hit that like button. Subscribe to Legends of the Frontier if you want more stories like this. And drop a comment. Tell me, do you think the people of Johnson County should have executed the regulators when they had the chance? Next episode, we're covering the Mountain Meadows Massacre, a wagon train, a Mormon militia, and one of the darkest chapters in American history. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you there.